Why does speaking in front of a crowd make your heart race, your mouth go dry, and your brain freeze? It turns out it's not irrational, it's ancient, and you're not alone. Fear of public speaking, also known as glossophobia, is one of the most common phobias in the world. Surveys consistently rank it as one of the top human fears, often above the fear of death. That's right, many people would rather be in the casket than giving the eulogy. But here's the strange thing: public speaking isn't inherently dangerous. No lions, no cliffs, no sudden drop in oxygen levels. So why does it feel like you're being hunted? Why does your brain treat a PowerPoint presentation in a conference room like a life or death situation? To find the answer, we need to look far, far back, tens of thousands of years into the past, when our ancestors roamed the savannah in tight-knit bands of hunter-gatherers. The fear of public speaking is deeply rational, just wildly out of date. Because in the world of early humans, being judged by your peers wasn't just embarrassing, it could be fatal. Ostracization from the group meant no food, no protection, and no chance of passing on your genes. In evolutionary terms, being disliked was life-threatening. In this video, we're going to explore the hidden evolutionary roots of glossophobia. We'll break down what the science says about how our brains evolved to manage social standing, how language made public evaluation more potent and more dangerous, and why your nervous system still hasn't caught up to the modern world. We're also going to look at cross-cultural studies, neurological scans, and even primate behavior to understand how deeply embedded this fear really is. And by the end, you might not love public speaking, but you'll understand why it terrifies you so much, and why that fear may have once saved your life. So whether you're prepping for a TED Talk, a classroom presentation, or just dreading having to speak up at the dinner table, this is the ancient story behind your modern panic. Glossophobia, which translates to fear of the tongue from Greek, is a complex, multi-layered phenomenon that affects roughly 77% of the population to some degree. It ranges from mild nervousness to full-blown panic attacks, and it's common across cultures, professions, and age groups. But why? Why does public speaking provoke such a visceral, physical response? To begin answering that, we have to first understand what it isn't. It's not simply shyness. To be shy is a personality trait, a general tendency to avoid social interactions. Glossophobia, on the other hand, is situation specific. You might be outgoing and confident with your friends, but the moment all eyes are on you, your body betrays you. Racing heart, dry mouth, shaking hands, and that creeping desire to just disappear. These are not voluntary reactions. They're governed by the autonomic nervous system, specifically the sympathetic branch, the part responsible for the fight or flight response. Studies show that even anticipating public speaking can trigger significant spikes in cortisol, the body's main stress hormone. Interestingly, fMRI scans show that the amygdala, a brain region involved in fear and threat detection, becomes highly active during public speaking scenarios, especially when subjects are anticipating judgment or negative feedback. This neural activity mirrors what you'd expect if someone were facing a physical threat. Why would speaking in front of others, something that seems so innocuous, light up the fear circuitry in our brains? From a psychological perspective, glossophobia shares many traits with social anxiety disorder, the fear of being negatively evaluated, embarrassed, or rejected. In fact, public speaking is the most common specific fear reported among people with social anxiety disorder. And even among those who don't meet the clinical threshold, speaking anxiety is still pervasive. In today's world, this fear shows up in obvious places: classrooms, office meetings, weddings, interviews, and even YouTube videos. But it can also manifest subtly: hesitating before asking a question in a group, dreading conference calls, or avoiding leadership roles altogether. What's striking is how universal the fear is. You'd expect a phobia this common to have some biological or evolutionary function, and that's where things get interesting. Glossophobia is not merely a learned behavior or cultural quirk. The sheer pervasiveness of the fear, coupled with the strength of the body's physiological response, suggests that it might be evolutionarily hardwired, a leftover from a time when standing out in front of a group came with real consequences. Public speaking, in this sense, isn't just about talking, it's about being seen, being judged, and potentially being rejected. And to our ancient ancestors, rejection didn't mean embarrassment, it might have meant death. We'll get deeper into those evolutionary stakes in the next section, but suffice it to say, the roots of glossophobia run far deeper than stage fright. They run straight through our brain's ancient threat detection systems. To understand why public speaking induces such terror, we have to ask a much bigger question. Why does social evaluation feel like a threat at all? From an evolutionary perspective, fear responses are adaptive. They evolved to help organisms survive threats in their environment. We fear heights because falling can kill us. We fear snakes and spiders because some are venomous. Humans are not just physical beings, though. We are profoundly social animals. For most of our evolutionary history, survival depended on being part of a group. Early human communities were small, tightly bonded bands, typically consisting of 50 to 150 individuals. Within these groups, cooperation wasn't optional, it was everything. You needed others to hunt effectively, to share food, to raise children, and to protect you from those predators or rival bands. Being exiled from the group was effectively a death sentence. This meant our brains evolved to be hypersensitive to social standing and group dynamics. Being liked, trusted, and respected wasn't just a perk, it was a prerequisite for survival. This is where the fear of public speaking comes into play. When you speak in front of others, especially a group, your brain perceives a massive risk, the risk of social rejection. Standing alone while others judge your words and demeanor stimulates a uniquely vulnerable position. If you're awkward, forgetful, or just not convincing, your quote-unquote status may decline. Your evolutionary brain interprets that as a direct threat to your survival, even if, rationally, you're just giving a toast at a wedding. Psychologist Mark Leary coined the term sociometer theory to describe how our self-esteem functions like a social barometer. According to this theory, our brains are constantly scanning for signs of social acceptance or rejection and adjusting our behavior and emotions accordingly. When you stand in front of a crowd, your sociometer starts screaming. Every raised eyebrow or stifled yawn feels like a signal that your social value is being reassessed. This is not just metaphorical, it's neurological. Neuroimaging studies show that the anterior cingulate cortex, ACC, an area of the brain associated with the experience of physical pain, is activated during experiences of social rejection. In other words, your brain processes social exclusion much like it would a broken bone or burn. That's how seriously your nervous system takes it. Now combine this with another evolutionary quirk. Humans are one of the only species that use language to coordinate complex social strategies. Language introduced an entirely new level of social risk. It meant you could now be judged not by your behavior, but by your ideas, your ability to persuade, to narrate, or to lead. Public speaking evolved into a kind of social ritual, a test of competence, intelligence, and charisma. Our ancestors didn't have PowerPoint, but they did have councils, arguments, and group decisions. Those who communicated well often became leaders. Those who stumbled might be perceived as unreliable or unintelligent, and they risked losing social capital or being marginalized. Anthropologist Joseph Henrich points out that in small-scale societies, status hierarchies are built on prestige, not just brute force. Prestige comes from being perceived as competent, especially in domains valuable to the group, like storytelling, teaching, or organizing. Public speech, even in the most archaic forms, became a tool for navigating that hierarchy. So when you stand in front of a room and feel your stomach churn, it's not because you're broken. It's because your mind is tapping into ancient hardwired mechanisms designed to protect your social body the way your reflexes protect your physical one. This also helps explain why the fear of public speaking is so visceral. The amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, isn't subtle. It's built to err on the side of caution. If there's even a hint of social danger, it fires off a cascade of signals: adrenaline, increased heart rate, tightened muscles, and shallow breathing. And in a twisted way, that's kind of beautiful. It means your fear of public speaking is actually a reflection of your deep need to belong. Your brain is trying to protect your place in the tribe. The shame, embarrassment, and panic you feel aren't bugs in the system, they're features that evolved to help you stay alive. Of course, the modern world has shifted the context. Public speaking today typically won't get you exiled or eaten, but evolution moves slowly. We still carry the emotional architecture of our Pleistocene ancestors, and that architecture interprets judgment as a kind of social death. What's fascinating is that this same evolutionary fear also gave rise to some of humanity's greatest achievements. The ability to influence a group with your voice, to inspire or persuade, this became one of the most powerful tools for survival and leadership. So, yes, glossophobia is a fear, but it's also a mirror reflecting just how vital language and status have always been to the human story. On a side note, I'm happy to share that the channel has picked up a bunch of new subscribers recently, and it's growing at a pretty exciting rate. For those who are new, I have a free newsletter linked in the description of all my videos. If you subscribe, you'll get additional free content and notified with new videos, ebooks, and other stuff I release. Go check it out after the video. Now let's jump back in. If the fear of public speaking is rooted in human evolution, as we've argued so far, then we would expect to find it across all, or at least most, cultures, regardless of geography, language, or lifestyle. And indeed, that's exactly what we see. Glossophobia appears to be a human universal, but that doesn't mean it looks the same everywhere. Numerous cross-cultural studies have confirmed that public speaking anxiety exists in virtually every society studied. In fact, surveys in both Western and non-Western nations consistently find that fear of speaking in front of others ranks among the top phobias, often above death itself, as I mentioned earlier. That alone tells us that this is no mere product of modernity or media. It's baked deep into the human psyche. However, the intensity of this fear and how it's expressed varies significantly between cultures. This variation offers fascinating insight into how social norms, cultural values, and communication styles shape the way people experience and manage fear. One of the most commonly used frameworks to understand cultural differences is Hofstede's cultural dimensions theory. In particular, two of these dimensions, individualism versus collectivism and power distance, can shed light on why some societies produce more public speaking anxiety than others. In highly individualistic cultures, like in the United States, Australia, or the UK, people are often encouraged to express themselves openly and assert their uniqueness. Personal opinions, especially when well articulated, are viewed as valuable. Consequently, individuals in these cultures may feel intense pressure to perform well during public speaking situations, since their speech is interpreted as a reflection of their identity, intelligence, and self-worth. Ironically, this emphasis on self-expression can amplify anxiety. When the stakes feel personal, when your performance is seen as a measure of your individual value, failure becomes more threatening. This likely explains why American college students, for example, report higher levels of public speaking anxiety than their counterparts in collectivist societies. In contrast, in collectivist cultures like Japan, China, or Korea, social harmony and group cohesion are often prioritized over individual expression. In these societies, it's more important to speak in ways that don't disrupt consensus or attract unnecessary attention. This doesn't eliminate the fear of public speaking, but it does change the context. In some cases, it may actually reduce anxiety because individuals aren't expected to stand out with a dazzling solo performance. But there's a flip side. Collectivist societies may produce anxiety of a different sort: fear of embarrassing the group, dishonoring the family, or violating implicit social norms. In Japan, for example, students are less likely to ask questions in class or participate in open debate, not because they're shy or unopinionated, but because they've been culturally conditioned to avoid imposing on the group dynamic. In these contexts, anxiety arises from fear of disrupting harmony rather than fear of individual failure. Another relevant factor is power distance, the extent to which a culture accepts and expects unequal distributions of power. In high power distance cultures, like the Philippines or many Arab countries, people are often expected to defer to authority figures and maintain formal communication styles. Speaking publicly, especially in front of superiors, may carry more weight and more risk. In these settings, the fear of speaking out of turn or contradicting someone in authority can intensify glossophobia. You're not just nervous about your performance, you're worried about violating social protocol or appearing disrespectful. In contrast, low power distance societies like Denmark or the Netherlands tend to value egalitarianism and open dialogue. This can lower the psychological stakes, as audiences are less likely to penalize speakers for minor mistakes or informal tones. Culture also affects how people express and regulate their emotions. In Western cultures, it's common to openly acknowledge and discuss fears, including stage fright. This normalization of anxiety can be helpful because it can create room for therapeutic intervention and peer support. But in other cultures, especially those with strong norms around emotional restraint, such as many East Asian or Nordic countries, people may be less likely to admit feeling anxious. That doesn't mean that they experience less fear, it just means the fear is more internalized and potentially more difficult to address. There's even a fascinating phenomenon in Japan known as Taijin Kyofusho, which is often considered a culture bound variety of social anxiety. Rather than feeling embarrassment for oneself, people with Taijin Kyofusho fear that their actions, like speaking poorly, might offend or discomfort others. It's a kind of hyper empathetic anxiety, deeply rooted in collective responsibility and shame. Another dimension worth mentioning is the difference between oral and literate cultures. In societies with strong oral traditions, like many indigenous cultures of Africa, Oceania, and the Americas, public speaking is often integrated into everyday life, not separated as a special event. Storytelling, ritual speech, and community dialogue are woven into the cultural fabric. This doesn't mean there's no anxiety involved, but it may mean that people raised in these environments learn to speak in front of others from a young age, in informal and supportive settings. The formalized, isolated, spotlight heavy environments of modern speeches or presentations might actually be a more recent invention and a more anxiety inducing one. So, while the evolutionary roots of glossophobia are shared across humanity, the way this fear plays out is colored by culture. In some societies, it's a fear of failure. In others, a fear of disruption. In some, the speaker is terrified of being judged, and in others, of causing discomfort. The common thread is the risk of losing social value, but the pathways to that risk are many. To understand why public speaking can be so terrifying, we also need to look at what's going on under the hood. The experience of glossophobia isn't just psychological or cultural, it's profoundly neurobiological. We've touched on this already, but fear, embarrassment, and the anticipation of judgment all engage deeply rooted neural circuitry designed to detect threats and coordinate rapid survival responses. And when you're standing in front of a crowd, your brain may react as if you're about to be attacked, not applauded. At the center of this neural fear response is a small, almond-shaped structure buried deep in the temporal lobe, the amygdala. Often referred to as the brain's alarm system, the amygdala is responsible for detecting potential threats and triggering a cascade of responses that prepare the body for action, usually described as fight, flight, or freeze responses. Research shows that the amygdala responds not only to physical threats like snakes or sharp objects, but also to social threats, especially the possibility of negative evaluation by others. In public speaking situations, simply perceiving an audience's blank stares or raised eyebrows can light up the amygdala, as if you're facing a predator. Functional MRI studies have repeatedly shown that the amygdala becomes hyperactive when individuals anticipate being judged or criticized. This hyperactivity is often paired with increased activation in the anterior cingulate cortex, which monitors for social errors, and the insula, which processes internal states like disgust or anxiety. Together, these areas form a kind of social danger network that helps us detect and avoid behaviors that could lead to embarrassment or exclusion. This sensitivity to social scrutiny is likely a result of what evolutionary psychologists call the social brain hypothesis, the idea that human intelligence evolved to navigate, at least to some degree, complex social relationships, not just physical environments. In a world where survival depended on maintaining alliances and avoiding disgrace, the brain became finely tuned to detect even subtle cues of disapproval. From this perspective, the fear of public speaking isn't irrational at all. It's the brain doing its best to protect your reputation, which in ancestral environments could be a matter of life and death. Being laughed at or rejected by your tribe might not kill you directly, but it could lead to ostracism, resource deprivation, or a reduced chance of mating, all of which would have been existential threats. In fact, just imagining being evaluated by others activates the same brain regions involved in physical pain, such as the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex. This supports earlier findings suggesting that social pain and physical pain share overlapping neural pathways. No wonder it feels so terrible when you bomb a speech. It's literally painful. Another key player is the default mode network, a set of brain regions that become active when we're not focused on the outside world, but instead engaged in self referential thinking. This includes reflecting on our own identity, reliving past mistakes, and imagining how others are perceiving us. During public speaking, many people experience a surge of default mode network activity, leading to excessive self monitoring, rumination, and a kind of mental time travel through worst case scenarios. This overreaction can disrupt the prefrontal cortex's ability to regulate anxiety and maintain focus, making it harder to concentrate, recall information, or even speak fluently. This mental noise, constantly wondering, do I sound stupid? Or what if I mess up? Can become a self fulfilling prophecy, increasing the chances of actually stumbling over your words. In extreme cases, it leads to performance paralysis, where the speaker blanks out under pressure, overwhelmed by their own inner critic. What about the physical symptoms of glossophobia, like sweaty palms, dry mouth, pounding heart, shortness of breath? These are coordinated by the aforementioned sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system, which primes the body for immediate action. The vagus nerve, which connects the brainstem to the heart, lungs, and gut, plays a major role here. Under stress, it downregulates parasympathetic functions like digestion and relaxation and activates sympathetic ones like pupil dilation and increase of blood flow to muscles. While these reactions make sense when facing a predator, they're not necessarily helpful when you're trying to relax and remember your next sentence. Interestingly, research shows that vagal tone, a measure of how effectively the vagus nerve regulates stress, correlates with emotional resilience. People with higher vagal tone tend to recover more quickly from stressful situations and show less public speaking anxiety. This has led some researchers to suggest that breathing techniques, mindfulness, and other vagus calming practices could be effective strategies for overcoming glossophobia. And it's also worth noting that people specifically diagnosed with social anxiety disorder often show different patterns of brain activity during social tasks, including public speaking. For example, they exhibit hypersensitivity in the amygdala and insula, along with reduced activity in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which normally helps regulate fear. All of these findings underscore that while fear of public speaking is deeply biological and nearly universal, its intensity can vary significantly across individuals and cultures. If fear of public speaking is rooted in evolution and shaped by culture and brain chemistry, then the next natural question is, how have humans coped with this fear? The answer isn't just in self-help books and TED Talk coaches. Throughout human history, cultures have developed rituals, tools, and social practices to help people manage the anxiety of speaking in front of others. And today, modern psychology and neuroscience offer further strategies to build on this ancient foundation. In many traditional societies, public speaking is not a spontaneous or casual activity. It is ritualized, often embedded in religious or ceremonial contexts. Think of a priest delivering a sermon, a chief giving a speech before a hunt, or a shaman chanting to invoke spirits. These are highly structured performances with predictable formats, fixed language, and collective expectations. Anthropologist Victor Turner argued that ritual performances function as a kind of social drama, allowing individuals to symbolically engage with high-stakes issues in a controlled setting. By placing speech within a ritual framework, complete with costumes, scripts, and even rehearsed behaviors, cultures can reduce ambiguity and anxiety. The speaker isn't improvising for judgmental strangers, they're inhabiting a role, backed by tradition. These practices often come with built-in physiological regulation mechanisms: drumming, chanting, deep breathing, and synchronized movement, all of which can downregulate the stress response and activate the parasympathetic nervous system. In other words, our ancestors weren't just winging it. They embedded speaking anxiety with social systems that made it manageable, even empowering. In contemporary settings, the most empirically supported intervention for glossophobia is cognitive behavioral therapy. This approach involves identifying irrational thoughts, like "everyone will think I'm an idiot," and replacing them with more accurate evidence-based ones, like "even if I mess up, most people won't care." Cognitive behavioral therapy also uses exposure therapy, where individuals gradually confront feared situations in a controlled way, like first speaking to a small group, then a larger one, until the fear response habituates. Importantly, studies show that people who complete these programs for social anxiety not only report feeling better, they also show measurable changes in brain activity, such as reduced amygdala activation and improved connectivity between the amygdala and prefrontal cortex. So, yes, you really can rewire your fear. Beyond cognitive tools, physical techniques can have a profound impact. As discussed in the previous section, vagal tone, which reflects the body's ability to regulate stress, plays a key role in how people handle social situations. High vagal tone is associated with greater calmness, emotional control, and social connectedness. One way to activate the vagus nerve is through deep, slow breathing, especially diaphragmatic breathing, which slows the heart rate and signals safety to the brain. Mindfulness practices that combine breath awareness and non-judgmental observation of thoughts also reduce anxiety by strengthening the insula's regulatory function and decreasing default mode network hyperactivity. Similarly, adopting quote-unquote power poses, such as standing tall with your chest open, can shift not only how others perceive you, but how you feel about yourself. While some aspects of this research have been debated, other studies support the idea that posture and body language can influence stress hormones and increase feelings of confidence. Another powerful, evolutionarily ancient strategy is don't go it alone. In small-scale societies, public speaking usually occurred in communal settings where the speaker was surrounded by kin, allies, and shared cultural values. Contrast that with today's anonymous audiences, Zoom calls, lecture halls, and internet comment sections where support is uncertain. Research shows that simply having social support present can buffer against the physiological effects of stress. One landmark study by Cohn, Schaefer, and Davidson found that holding a loved one's hand while anticipating pain reduced activity in the threat circuitry of the brain, including the amygdala. This suggests that social connection literally makes the brain feel safer. This is why many people report lower anxiety when speaking with friends or familiar coworkers than to strangers. It's also why group-based therapy peer programs are effective. They provide a safe, structured environment to practice and receive encouragement. By reframing speaking not as a threat to our personal worth, but as a contribution to a larger human story, we can change our experience of it. Glossophobia is not just a modern fear, it's an ancient one, rooted deep in our evolutionary past. As highly social primates, our survival once depended on group approval and status. To be shamed, rejected, or publicly scrutinized could mean exclusion, and in prehistoric times, that would mean death. This is why our brains still react to audiences like they're predators. The amygdala fires off alarms, stress hormones flood our bodies, and our minds imagine the worst-case scenarios. But while this fear feels primal, it's also shaped by modern culture. This all reveals the incredible social sensitivity that defines us as a species, and it's not permanent. Understanding the biology, psychology, and cultural context behind these fears gives us a power. With practice, reframing, and even ritual, we can move from fear to connection, turning anxiety into presence. Because ultimately, speaking in front of others is about being seen, being heard, and sharing something human. The fear of public speaking is real, but so is our capacity to overcome it. And in doing so, we're tapping into one of the oldest, most meaningful parts of what makes us human. For more on the evolution of human sociality, watch this video on the left. For more on ancient fears, watch the video on the right. And with that, I'll see you in the next one. Stay curious.